Are you kidding? I had to rush back to my seat to turn my camera on because I'm in the background going, yes, yes, all of that. So far, so great. I mean, the thoughts, the questions are so deep and thought-provoking. I'm enjoying myself so far, and I hope everyone else, all of you in your respective little places, are enjoying yourselves too. And I hope that you are tweeting about this and Facebooking and all of that. Get people involved, because it's not too late for people to register if they haven't had time to join us for today. They can join us for the next session tomorrow.
Totally. And on that note too, I think Kiedra and I, in our many conversations this past week, have been sort of individually and collectively freaking out because our panelists for this session, we all really love. And it's always a very exciting thing to be able to talk with folks that you love and get to tell them to their, faces, albeit virtual faces, but nonetheless get to tell them how much you admire them. And so we are super freaking thrilled to be able to spend this time with y'all today. And we appreciate you making time in your schedule in this kind of weird, bizarre version of what scheduling looks like at this time. We are super thrilled to kind of have what honestly is sort of our dream team of lineup of scholars for both of our Pro Scholar roundtables. It was sort of like we had our dream list and then everybody said yes, and it was like the angels singing. And so to kind of make sure that we have enough time for everybody to be able to talk about kind of their experiences, we're hoping to cover a big breadth of things. We thought it would be good if we can kind of go around and do the introductions and sort of have y'all introduce yourselves to the audience, and also tell us a little bit about how you got interested in comics and comic book storytelling. And so I'm wondering if we can maybe start with Fernanda and then go to Lee and then Deborah and then Craig. So tell the people a little bit about yourself, and as well as let us know about how you kind of got started with comics and comic book storytelling.
Hello, everyone. I'm so glad to be here. Thank you so much, everyone, for organizing this panel. It's so awesome, and I have been enjoying all day zooming throughout all these beautiful voices. Well, I'm an assistant professor at Cornell College in Iowa. I am teaching ethnic studies, Latin American studies, and Spanish language. And I got interested in comics since I was very young. I was born and raised in the Yucatan Peninsula, the Caribbean side of Mexico. And I did my undergrad in the Yucatan. And during my undergrad, I started learning about Caribbean literature and what is the Caribbean area, how do we understand the Caribbean Sea, and the territories that are like the islands, etc. So there I got fascinated to know that I was part of the Caribbean and I wanted to learn more. So I did an undergrad dissertation on the Puerto Rican identity, citizenship and cultural identity as a colony. So for my master's and PhD, I didn't want to move from these Caribbean studies, but I wanted to do something else than a traditional narrative. So I started looking at potential graphic narratives in the Caribbean. I did 2 exploratory trips when I was doing my PhD, one to the Dominican Republic to try to find comic artists and graphic narratives about the Dominican Republic. And then I did another trip to Puerto Rico with the same purpose. After both trips, I decided that I was going to research on Puerto Rican graphic narratives. So I started to visit the local independent comic festivals, and I started interviewing the local independent comic artists because I was very interested on how DC and Marvel have so many Puerto Ricans working in the superhero teams. But where are the Puerto Rican independent artists that do not work for the mainstream houses? So I did 3 months of living in the island and tracing all these artists, and I was very interested on the female artists that do not work for Marvel or DC, and they produce and publish their own graphic narratives. So that's how I developed this long list of female Puerto Rican graphic narrative artists, and I will be very happy to share some of them with you all.
Fantastic. Lee, tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got your start. You are muted.
I got it now. Guhatiapa, Tuake Trash, Guahindame Lee Francis, Washesh Wakame, Marianame. Thank you all, Tawae, for allowing me to be here. My name is Lee Francis. My family is from the Pueblo of Laguna, Native American here, 45 miles west of Albuquerque, New Mexico, which is where I live in Albuquerque. My background really is in education. So my PhD work from Texas State is in educational leadership. I've been working in school systems, around leadership issues, language and culture, literature, theater, a whole bunch of wide range of things to work with Native students for most of my working career at this point. One of the things that I began to see and kind of where I got my start in terms of the work that I do was around the necessity of seeing Native superheroes and Native representation in comic books that was and still we're getting there, but was really missing, right? In terms of the folks that were in comic books that were represented in a way that was authentic and dynamic. So it wasn't just, like natives on horseback and feathers, food, feathers, and fun, as I like to call it. So, so seeing that and seeing the number of kids that I know, kind of like me, because I'm an Indigenerd. So I grew up on comic books and graphic novels. I grew up with sci-fi. My dad was a huge sci-fi fan. I'm excited Dune is coming out. That was like required reading in my household. So like it's really exciting. And I think I came by it really honestly in terms of like it was never something where my family or my dad and my mom were just like, oh, you shouldn't be reading comics because whatever. They were just like, there's things to read, go read. So they were really excited about that. So that's kind of where I come by it. I come by it pretty honestly in that space. I've been teaching for a while. About 5-6 years ago, I recognized that the work that I could do was not only in education, but also in publishing. And so I founded my company, Native Realities, which to this date is still the largest independent publisher of Native comic books. Out in the US, Canada is doing some amazing work. First Nations Canada, some great publishers up there, but in the US, we're kind of the ones that are holding that torch. 2 years after that, we started the Indigenous Comic Con. So I founded that as a way to bring Native comic creators and folks in pop culture together. We had to cancel this year like everybody else, but we are hopefully going to be back next year for our 4th year. It would have been our 5th year, our 4th year of running the Comic Con. And then I opened up Red Planet Books and Comics. So it's the only Native comic shop in the world. We specialize most of this stuff to support Indigeners. And as I define an Indigener, it's anybody that wants to see positive, dynamic, authentic representations of Native people, by Native people, for Native people, and about Native people. So that's my work.
I love it. I'm so excited already. Deborah, Dr. Whaley, please tell us a little bit about you and all of the super cool work that you do.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. And thank you, Katlin and Kiedra, for moderating, and to everyone who put this together and put it together in a virtual form so quickly. This is amazing. So thank you for having me. So yes, I'm Deborah Whaley. I am currently at the University of Iowa, and I'm a professor of American Studies and African American Studies, and I'm trained as an Americanist, and I do work on popular culture and comics, cinema, social movements, gender, race and ethnicity, visual culture. And I also do work in the digital humanities. And so right now I am a administrative fellow in the Dean's office working on issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion, those three magic words that I've already heard sort of come up in other panels in interesting ways. So, I think I'm here because I wrote this book called Black Women in Sequence on representations of Black women in comics, graphic novels, and anime, but I also talk about television and gaming and other forms of sequential art. And I've published a few other pieces on comics on Afro anime and Aaron McGruder's The Boondocks. And I just published, came out a piece on Afro-Goth comics and music. And so I'm super excited about that. And so I know my full bio was, printed in the materials. So anything else you want to know about me, just go to DeborahElizabethWhaley.com. So how I came to comics, several entry points for me. As I mentioned, I am an artist. I do all different types of art, painting, drawing, mixed media. But I started out in art drawing comics. And that just came out of not only reading the comic books that my older sisters and other people in my family were reading, and just for some reason I was drawn to the narratives, but I was really drawn to the visuality of comics. And so I just started drawing comics and copying the pages in the comic books, and I would do the same thing with comic strips. And also, I'm sure I don't look this old, but I am a child of the 70s and the early 80s. We were lucky enough to have television shows like Batman, although it was in reruns by the time I came along, at least I could say that. But we had other shows like Wonder Woman, and I was just so transfixed by those televisual images too as a young girl. And just, looking at these images on the small screen of powerful people in these narratives doing amazing things, and especially Eartha Kitt's rendition of Catwoman on the Batman television series, I was really transfixed by. And then later I did some formal training in cartooning, and that's the only training I've had in art is in cartooning. And so I continue to draw comics and read comics and enjoy sequential art in various forms, television, film, and print. And then I'll leave it there, but all this sort of background growing up, being drawn to comics, drawing comics, and being a scholar, and then later just finding my way to publishing and writing about comics, which I originally had not intended to do. It was sort of my art world. And it's just something that happened, and I'm so glad that it did.
I suspect that everybody's enjoying this as much as Kiedra and I are, because the chat is blowing up. But last and certainly not least, Craig, sorry if you get that street noise. Craig, can you tell us a little bit about yourself, please? You are muted. You're still muted, Craig.
There we go. All right. So first off, thank you for having me on this panel. It's really an honor to be here with everybody, and I'm going to try my best to speak instead of just obsessively listen to what everyone has to say. But I might just be like, oh my, oh, everybody's so great. I guess I'll open up with the question because it'll lead into everything else naturally. I got into comics initially as a kid because dad was super into sports, brother was super into sports. I was the youngest. And so I got into capes and tights while everybody else was getting those baseball cards and basketball cards. I was in the background reading comics. Eventually, I drew a lot, and I ended up kind of walking away from comics in a way and focusing on fine art, and got my bachelor's in art, and was working a lot on painting, on illustration in a more kind of like, formal art industry way, and eventually got into curation, and at some point, I got back into comics, especially once I realized, even though I still maintained a love for like the capes and tights and stuff, continued reading, I wanted to make other kinds of comics, especially comics that have to do with broader issues than the kind of like narratives that I was seeing in comics, which were fun and funny, but like I would always make jokes about Batman being Dick Cheney in a cape, and just like it was just like there was that kind of narrative in my mind. And once I kind of expanded and broadened my relationship with comics, reading more day in the life narratives, and then even going back into more fantastic narratives that reflected a different kind of like different tropes and different identities, I was able to kind of incorporate that into my art practice, and then just ended up making comics again. As far as what I do, I'm currently an assistant professor over at CCAD, Columbus College of Art and Design. I publish primarily through Hyperallergic, which is an art publication in New York, and recently have released the place that people usually recognize my work from. It's How to Draw a Black Eye, which came out several years back. But most recently, this came out either earlier this week or the end of last week, was Artist in Residence, which is a story about a group of artists in prison trying to maintain an art practice. So I recommend everybody go check that out. They're fantastic artists and fantastic people. So those stories are there. And I was happy to, I really like the prospect of giving a platform to an artist who's incarcerated. And so that's by Adam Roberts, was the writer and illustrator. I merely did the lettering and inking and the yelling at publishers. So that's all I did. And creating platforms for other folks have been a major part of my practice. There have been other things in there. A Wonder, a Conversation with Women, focusing on 60s feminist comics, all this other stuff. It's a bunch of stuff. So that's
so our second question is for Lee, Deborah, and Craig. According to Amy Stornialo and Ebony Elizabeth Thomas in their essay, Restoring as Political Action, Authoring Resistance Through Youth Media Arts, restoring is a way young people use digital media tools to write themselves into existence, first narrating and analyzing their lived experiences, and then synthesizing and recontextualizing those stories to represent a diversity of perspectives and reshape dominant narratives. Given that each of you do work related to comics and narratives about characters who are Black, Indigenous, and people of color, could you talk about how graphic novels and graphic adaptations of literature could perhaps be a way of writing ourselves into history?
Are we going in order?
Whatever works for you all.
I would say that just based on the like artist in residence, and I did this series, How to Protest Art, where I really I feel like I had to actively step back as far as my role as an artist, and really allow for my work to reflect a platform for someone else to speak. And so it would often involve me just giving like a solid page of nothing but quoting and citing the quotes from specific activists and spaces. From me allowing for people to write pages of comics that I just illustrate, even if I illustrate and write the broader platform. And so I, in my mind, there is something about allowing for, even if my hand is really present in it, even if my voice is sprinkled throughout it, making sure that other voices are part of my work has become really important to me. I think several years ago, there were talks about what is the function of curators. And I think making sure that other people have platforms to speak is really important to my personal practice, and especially people who don't look like me.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
I'll jump in on the end of that. I think that that's, you know, one of the key parts. Did we just do that? Did we both unmute? um, I think it's one of those moments where it's writing Native and Indigenous people back into the historical narrative where they've been erased or they have conformed to or been assimilated into a very narrative that developed back in the 400 years ago in the 1600s, right? So this idea of how do we not continue to write to the noble savage? How do we not continue to write to the red devil, the Westerns, right? So the work I do when I write comics, I try to write as much modern as I can. And when I write historical, I try to find the narratives where Native voices aren't represented, very similar, right? So I'm kind of doing a past, history echo. The illustrator I work with Jojo Alvitre, and I just published Ghost River, The Fall and Rise of the Conestoga out of the library company out of Philadelphia, where we were able to sort of weave within those spaces that the Western narrative, that the American narrative did not afford us a voice as Native and Indigenous peoples, and the Conestoga people and the Lenape people in and around Philadelphia. So we were able to bring that back and really start to bring agency, so that Native folks are not just victims of history as this tragic narrative that America has presented of Native identity. And again, I point to like even things that are as important as Standing Rock. What are the images that made it into the popular consciousness? There's a Native on horseback facing down tanks, right? Like that doesn't show any of the work that Native people are actually doing in the space. They didn't show all of the grandmas and the aunties doing nonviolence training. What we see is what conforms to American pop culture understandings of Native identity, right? So it's the tragedy of what's going to happen to Native people, right? There he is on horseback facing down these things. It's that sort of underdog mentality that we have, but that gives no agency for Native folks in the story. So when I try to weave that stuff in, I try to rewrite or at least find the spaces and the gaps that give Native folks agency and voice in those particular spaces, historically, modernly, and then into the future with Indigenous futurisms and postmodernism.
So I guess I can jump in now. You mentioned folks using digital tools to write themselves into history. I'd be really interested to hear more about what that means to you all. For me, it made me think about webcomics. And so several of the women I wrote about in my last book decided to do their comics through the form of webcomics through the internet because they did not have to worry about the means of production. They were able to create and produce and disseminate and get themselves out there. And so for them, just that ability to take control and also to have the ability to present representations that are oftentimes absent. And I mean specifically talking about people of color, people of African descent, women, disability, sexualities, the whole gamut of difference that is definitely making its way into scholarship and into the comics themselves. But we can always do more and better. And so I think for a lot of folks who are artists, they have used the internet in really amazing ways. I'm also thinking of the critical mass of Black women artists that use the term the Orms Society, naming themselves after the Black female cartoonist Jackie Orms, who did comics in the 30s and 40s and 50s, and then seeing her as a sort of guidepost and a legacy that they wanted to keep going. So they used the internet to, put their work on the internet, to converse with each other through chat rooms, and they were able to introduce the masses to their work. You also mentioned the idea of adaptation. And I think in terms of adaptation and history, there's some really amazing work being done by Joel Christian Gill, who is an artist, he's a teacher, and he's a scholar. And what he has done is he's taken really important touchstones in Black history that are really lesser known, like going into the archive and finding key people that are important, but are not, don't stick out as some of the other key figures that are more likely to crop up in history classes, if they crop up at all. And so he's done some wonderful comics about women in sport, about civil rights figures, again, that are lesser known. And so I think for him, taking these moments in history and not just inserting the Black subject into it, but trying to provide a sort of wider trajectory to everyday people of African descent who made a difference in many ways in terms of social justice, and giving them the platform of the comic book as he has drawn and rewritten their narratives and making it available to the masses. I also think of the work of John Jennings, who I know he's so amazing, and he's participating in this as well. And I think of his adaptions of Octavia Butler's work, right? And so Octavia Butler is such an amazing, obviously she has passed, but is such an amazing writer. Oftentimes she's taught in literature classes, in American studies classes and African American studies classes, but she's and people read her science fiction. It's sort of a mix, as we all know, science fiction dash horror dash a lot of different things, but him and Damien Duffy's reiteration of her work through the form of a graphic novel just opens it up even more to a wider audience. And I've taught Octavia Butler in like my Black popular culture classes, and students love it. I recently taught John Jennings' adaptation of Kindred in my Black image in comics, graphic novels, and anime, and the students really loved the ability to read this graphic novel and to connect the visuality with the narrative. But the great thing about that particular graphic novel is it is talking about history, and it's talking about present times, and it's going back and forth. There's some Afrofuturism mixed in. And so I think when you teach history, one of the things that is really effective, at least for me as a pedagogue, is to connect the present times to the past, to let folks know, why these former occurrences still matter to us today, and where do we go forward. And that particular book does a really great job at laying that out in terms of issues of Blackness and class and gender and civil rights, and thinking about, okay, what are the legacies of slavery for people in contemporary times? How do they knit that together? How do they negotiate it? What scripts of the past are still with us today? So in terms of thinking about history, those are some of the things that I'm thinking about. And I'm really excited. If anything else comes up about digital humanities or digital tools and comics, I'll chime in a bit more.
Thank you so much for those responses. And even it's exciting because there's kind of a nice thread there to my next question for Fernanda in thinking about webcomics, because I know that's something that you also are very excited and passionate about in your research. And I was fortunate to hear you present on that back when we were still doing in-person conferences back in February at MSU Comics Forum. But something I wanted to ask you that kind of builds from that last question is that, as I was looking more into your research, I kind of learned that something that is a key area of interest for you is, as you put it, the artistic representations of crisis, disaster, trauma, and political trust in countries such as Mexico, the US, Puerto Rico, and Haiti. And I was wondering if you could tell us a bit more about the Nuyorican, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly, and Boricua artists that you study, and how the graphic narratives they produce have this potential, as you see it, to, quote, expand and rewrite colonial master narratives. And I wonder if you can perhaps also kind of build in a bit of discussion about sort of how you're also bringing these graphic narratives and scholarship to the classes that you're teaching in the fall, like your Latinx comics class.
Yes. Thank you so much for that question. Can I share my screen? I'm gonna try to share my screen. I have something that can help everyone to understand me a little bit better. So when I talk about these three terms, Nuyorican, Diasporicans, Boricuas, and Puerto Ricans, first of all, I ask everyone how they prefer to be called, how they identify themselves. These are categories that I don't like to give anyone, because I don't like when people put me as Mexican without acknowledging my Caribbean identity, my Yucatecan identity. So when I teach these artists, I do it from their own perspective, how they identify themselves. So the Nuyorican are artists that identify themselves as Puerto Ricans born and raised in El Barrio or the Bronx in New York City. Diasporicans are artists that identify themselves as Puerto Ricans, and they are born and raised throughout the diaspora. It doesn't have to be in New York. It could be born and raised in Oakland. It could be born and raised in Ohio, whatever, but with an honest identification as Puerto Rican or with roots in Puerto Rico. And then we have the Boricuas. The Boricuas are all these artists that are born, raised, currently living in the island, and most of them have no plans to leave the island. So they identify themselves as Boricuas. And so an example of a diasporican, it's Nikki Rodriguez. Nikki Rodriguez is here at SoulCon. She's also one of the artists I'm gonna teach in my Latinx class. Then we also have two artists that could call themselves, they call themselves Nuyorican. One is Edgardo Miranda with La Borinqueña, and Ivan Velez with Planet Bronx. Then we have a Boricua artist, which is Rosa Colon. Rosa Colon, she published a lot of webcomics on the Nib, and she calls herself Boricua, and she's one of the few artists that are born and raised in the island. She's not leaving the island. She produces from the island, and she managed she created and she managed the Tintero Independent Comic Festival in the island every year. So these are three examples of different, the different Boricua umbrella, the Puerto Rican umbrella. But we also have an artist that considers himself a Puerto Rican, but he also falls under the umbrella of Nuyorican diasporican, John Vasquez Mejias. He just created his graphic novel on woodcut, and he is born and raised in New York, and then moved to New Jersey, and then he considered himself a Puerto Rican. It's very interesting how this graphic novel is part of what you were asking, Katlin, because this is the first graphic novel that uses this title, the Puerto Rican War. Most of the time when we learn about the War of the 98, we always learn about it, that Hispanic American War from the US speech, from the US historical speech or historiography, or we learn about it at the 98 War, but we never hear the Puerto Rican War. This was the war where the US took Puerto Rico as a territory and from the Spanish Empire. So how we learn in school about this war is really, the title of this war is really important. It is not a Hispanic war. Why is a Hispanic, like that doesn't make any sense. Hispanic is a full continent. Hispanic is also one country in Europe. Like it is not the Hispanic American War, it's the Puerto Rican War. So that is part of the decolonizing speech through this graphic narrative that John Vasquez Mejias just published this year. And it is a beautiful piece. It's a masterwork. Another way that we could decolonize this historical way to learn about graphic narratives in the classroom is, what is the American experience? What do we understand as being American? What do we understand as being a citizen or an American? So I also teach Christy Road in my class. Christy Road is also in SoulCon, and she is writing, she is talking from her experience as an American experience being born and raised in a Cuban family in Miami. We also have the same sort of decolonizing citizenship and self-identification with Alberto Ledesma, Diary of a Reluctant Dreamer. All these narratives are talking about the American life, what it is to be American, what it is to experience America. And when we learned about this citizenship versus cultural identity, we are always trying to think the American experience through the lens of the Anglo-white American society. But what happened with all these American experiences that are in different languages? It could also be an indigenous language, like Undocumented, Workers' Fight from Duncan Tonatiuh. He recalls a Mixteco experience of all these undocumented indigenous working in New York City. So what is the American experience? What is the American life? So yeah, I think that's all for me for now. And if you wanna a list of all these webcomics that I am talking about, I will be very happy to share it with you if you write me an email.
Oh, amazing. Gracias, Fernanda. And I love that you kind of focus on nuance there, of nuanced storytelling, which brings me to a question for Lee. That, I wonder for you and your roles as CEO and publisher of Native Realities, owner of Red Planet Comics and Books in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and organizer of Indigipop X, right, or Indigenous Comic Con. I wonder I would love to hear a little bit more about just kind of how you are doing all of this work in ways that's really kind of put you in this kind of way that you're sort of envisioning different kinds of futures, right? And, something that I found is that in a 2018 interview with Cynthia Smith, you shared how when founding Native Realities back in 2015, your goal was to, quote, work on changing the perceptions and representations of Native people by presenting stories of Native people as superheroes and by unlocking the Indigenous imagination, which you spoke to in your previous response. And, among your latest projects, of course, you have many of them, which are all really exciting. But one that I would love to hear a bit more about is your anthology that you've worked on of Marvel Voices, Indigenous Voices #1, which will be released in November from Marvel Comics. And so I would love to hear a little bit more about just why is it crucial to have more nuanced representations of Native and Indigenous and First Nations folks in popular culture, but why also is it important for Native and Indigenous and First Nations creators to be the ones telling these stories or advising how these stories are told?
Yeah, thank you. And just to all of you, one thing I just wanted to say, I love sitting on these panels because I'm like, everybody brings all of their stuff, and I was like, oh, new books for the shop. So that is so exciting to me. Like, I'm gonna be ordering all this stuff. Everybody's got like everything that's on there. I'm just like, we have a whole shelf for this, right? So this is gonna be great. I'm so excited about this. I was like taking, I didn't even get your list. I was like taking screenshots. And I was just like, oh, this is awesome. I'm gonna order that. I'm gonna order this. So anyway, I just want to say that to everybody. I think, to your point, the reason why I think it's really important is I do a whole history. The history of Native people in pop culture stretches back 400 years. The first use of the term noble savage came in the mid-1600s. John Dryden's play called The Conquest of Granada. And it defined the terms of Indigenous people on the North American continent, what that archetype is going to look like. And it's been the hardest archetype to shake, right? Like, we cannot seem to get out of that. Some of the things I alluded to, but we see it in popular media and comic books and graphic novels. You see it from Last of the Mohicans, you see it in Fire, you see it, and these are the most popular novels. These are the most popular representations of Native people of the day. And what I say to folks when I talk about this stuff and when people come to the shop or whatever is, one of the things that we never got to do was to write our own stories. We were too busy trying to survive. When our population goes from 90%, 100% to 10%, truly a decimate, right? We were the original snap, right? Like, what happened to Native people is what is we ceased to exist. So we stopped, we weren't able to control our narrative. So other people were controlling our narrative all the way up until about the mid 1800s. That's 200 years of American iconography that was told on our behalf, right? So it wasn't until the mid 1800s when you start seeing people like Mourning Dove, you see Charles Eastman, where they begin to publish their own stories, but they're still published in a way that conforms to what the publisher wants, right? And I think that's been the biggest learning part for me is, and I think it comes from an educational standpoint. When I was an educator in high school, we were developing these incredible statewide curricula, you know, working with Native educators to implement stuff here in New Mexico, and nobody implements it because there's like, as much as we do the creative expression or the academic expression, the gatekeepers still keep the doors closed, right? So in terms of publishing Native folks, the whole point was that we need to reinterpret and reorient our own stories on our terms, not with the force or the reckoning that the publisher has and that they're going to put in. I cannot tell you how many times, because I've worked not only just the Native publishing side, but I've worked with so many writers. Since I was 15 years old, I've been working with Native writers. And, you know, as a mentee, working with my dad who worked with all these folks. And one of the things that is story over story over story is, can you make this a little more Native? Can you maybe add some more nativeness to this story? Because maybe a powwow of some sort, or can you add some more like feathers or like just some traditional things, right? When we're trying to publish and we're looking at the future and Indigenous futurisms, you know, the amazing term that, you know, Dr. Grace Dillon, you know, sort of formalized in her work and has been carried on by a number of other folks. This idea that it actually is culminating in how we are envisioning ourselves as I say, as a bright and glorious future, right? So my work in comic books is really about how do we articulate that, and also giving illustrators the chance, writers the chance to write their own stories. Because when we transition this over to Marvel or DC or Image, they're going to call particular shots, whether it be through the IP that they have, whether it be through the character archetypes that are already established. And even when you get Native folks into those positions, and it's something I did say to Marvel folks when they reached out to us, was I still want to see editors. I still want to see executives. It's great that we've got creatives on the ground, but that's almost no different because we're not going to see the change made because Natives had been hot. Natives were hot in the 80s. And then we all went away for a while. And then Natives were hot in the 90s. And then we weren't getting published anymore. And then Natives were hot in the 2000s. And then we weren't getting published anymore. Now we're in another decade. And what is clear and obvious is that we're not seeing the change except when we're hot all of a sudden, because everybody wants to see Native stuff, because we don't have Native folks in these positions of creative control. So my work was to say, hey, I'm going to create a space, a publishing house. I'm also going to work the industry side of this is how I'm going to sell books. So working, you know, collaborating, however I'm going to say I'm collaborating with Marvel, we're distributing things, right? And I know all the artists is saying like, the only way this is going to change is if I sell a bunch of books. So my job is to sell a bunch of books. I got to get them into Native schools. I got to get them in the hands of academics because that's how capitalism works. That's how colonization works. We're not going to see that because it's just going to be like, oh, look, Marvel just checked their box and said, hey, we're all diverse now. Yay. And I don't want to diminish any of the work that my colleagues and all of these amazing Native creatives are doing in that. But that's the industry doing their thing. And my job is to get it out to people so that we can continue to do that.
Could I add on to that? Because that was one thing that was beautiful. That was beautiful. I think one of the issues, especially just growing up in America, because I'm first generation American. Both my parents are from Jamaica, right? And so growing up in America, I am Black. I'm just Black. That's just what I am. As far as my relationship with Black history, it is very American Black. And it's only as an adult do I realize that my entire identity was framed in the context of the way I'm perceived by the broader white population. And so by no means do I completely say, okay, from now on, I'm no longer reading any more African-American writers, and I'm totally gonna go Jamaican authors from now on, because you're just who you are at some point. you can't, it's really difficult to try to decolonize yourself, and it takes so much critique and analysis. And so then you're actively making art aware of this kind of paradoxical attempt to destroy the master's house. But all you have are the master's tools. I speak English. That's just what I do. And it's one of those things where I think back to me being a kid and me being aware of my Jamaicanness and it being in conflict with the relationship that colonialism has with other Black spaces. Because I remember being in the lunchroom and making fun of Haitian kids. We were just the dozens. And it was one of those things where it was very much dependent on this relationship that each one of those spaces had with colonialism as a whole, because that was about access. Being Jamaican was a point of pride because Bob Marley sold the most records. That was the highlight. And when you're a kid, that's how you contextualize things. And so making work, I recently made this comic called A Black Woman with Tenure. And it's this notion that it's reflecting on the idea that to be Black in academia, you can't be a human. Being a Black woman, you have to be Maya Angelou. You have to be. You can't have a drinking problem. You can't have any domestic violence issues. You can't have any criminal record. You can't have any kind of drug use in your background. You have to be perpetually kind. And at least as a Black man, I found I could get angrier. But with just watching the Black women in my life who especially function in higher levels of academia, there is this expectation of grace. And you realize that it's not that any of these women are acting a certain way. The fact is that that community is filtered. They are filtered to the point where only the most excellent can get through, while that same guard and that same standard isn't held by anybody else. And so that also continues to shape the way we treat people in our own communities and the stories that we tell about people in our own communities. And it's really difficult to find a balance and engage, because that relationship we have with ourselves, the narratives that we are allowed to tell about ourselves, the identities we are allowed to live just to have a voice that can be heard, is different from anybody else.
That's fantastic. Thank you for chiming in. Because we're running out of time, I want to preface this question by saying that there's a follow-up question. This next question is for Craig, but there's a follow-up question for Deborah, and I'm hoping, like a kid at Christmas, I'm hoping that you both will be able to address this thing, because, you know, Lovecraft Country is new for everybody, and I know that there's a way that we can fit this into this conversation. So my interest, my next question brings together my interest in Black girlhood, Black Lives Matter representation, and comics education, figuring into genres like horror and sci-fi. For example, in the newly released HBO series, Lovecraft Country, Diana Freeman, one of the characters on the show, she's played by Jada Harris, delivers another volume of her comic to her father before he leaves for another road trip. Diana's work features a powerful female sci-fi character. The heroine in her comic, like the author, is Black and female. I report all of this to ask, how do you think K-12 teachers can use comics and graphic novels to encourage their students to critically engage in discussions about how national idealism adamantly rejects Black folks, Indigenous folks, and people and folks of color?
For me, all right. All right. I think it's difficult for me to bring it to the teachers, because I think that a lot of the issues, first and foremost, land with publishing. I think that often publishing leads heavily on idealized Black figures and doesn't really paint the notion of people of color in general in broad strokes. When I think of unless it's a Black authorship, unless it's media marketed toward a Black community, there won't be more than 3 Black people in a space. And when you limit the number of people represented in a space, then you feel obligated to make sure that they aren't misrepresented in negative ways, and you end up just proposing that kind of strong Black woman stereotype, that kind of the hyper intellectual, like, Black man stereotype, this idealized. And it's not like those people don't exist. It's not like those stories aren't necessarily good, but I hope to see that change in the future. I find it's weird. I'm more cynical about publishing than I am about TV and film. I think a great place for that representation was actually True Detective Season 3, where you captured the nuance of a Black man who was not ideal in any way, who had a complex life, and you captured like 20 years of that arc, and even seeing his role as a father. I don't necessarily know how one pitches that as, I don't know, I guess I'm a bit cynical. I guess I'm concerned about publishing before I am about academia. Academia is a whole other beast, because that's a lot of cultural shifting. That's a lot of community. It's a lot of getting more people of color into faculty, and not just people of color who reflects the desires of the people hiring them. I think it's easy for people to be very reflexive in hiring processes in academia to find the safest people of color that they can, including myself. I'm really safe.
Thank you. I'd like to follow up this question with a question to Deborah. And if you want to backtrack and go back to the question that I asked Craig, you're welcome to do that also. In my last question, I was talking about Black girls and futurity and national idealism. There seems to be a fear associated with strong Black women, and I'm basing this on the way much of America responded to Michelle Obama, and before Barack Obama was even elected. There seems to be a pattern of attacking the young female figure for fear of her becoming a sort of mythological Medusa figure. So how could something like seeing a young Black girl reimagine how she sees folks who looks like her in idealistic spaces open the door for new hopescapes, to borrow a phrase from S.R. Tolliver?
That's a great question. And I also really like your question about K through 12 education. I used to teach junior high when I was working on my master's, and had I had the opportunity to teach some of the amazing things that everyone on this panel and people who are part of the conference are talking about, and just, sort of my own repertoire of things to sort of rethink how we conceptualize history and language, it just would have been wonderful. But for your question, and you would have no way of knowing this, but I really loved Medusa as a sort of touchstone of talking about representation, because when I was in first grade, I was teased horribly, and I was called Medusa, and they were basing this on the animation iteration of her in Sunday morning cartoons, because I had wild, darkish red hair that I guess they thought looked like snakes, and so I was Medusa when I was in first grade. So the way I looked just was threatening. And there wasn't even images of young Black girlhood, I guess, maybe that they could attach me to at the time, maybe let alone that I could relate to as well. I mean, there were some, but representation definitely matters. And I know there's some discourse about, should we still keep talking about issues of representation and absence and all of this? And even some of the women that I researched, not the ones I ended up having in the book as interviews, but some women were telling me, I'm so tired about being asked, what does it mean to do work on women or women of color? I just want to be an artist, and I don't want to have to talk about my ethnicity or whatever. And okay, great, that's fine, but I really don't think that we can deny that there is power in having the opportunity to, for folks to see themselves in a variety of roles in which oftentimes they are not depicted with nuance, right? And so, it just gets back to issues of mentorship and having the ability to see someone who's in a position that you aspire to, but perhaps you haven't had representations of that in your worldview up until a certain point. And so maybe you didn't even know, it was possible. And I think, insofar as sequential art is concerned, I'm so happy with the images that are out there now. Again, they're not perfect, but there's so much more than there was when I was coming up. I'm just thinking of versions of sequential art on television, right? Like Black Lightning has this amazing representation. I mean, that's a whole panel in itself. There's problems with that show. There really is. But the depictions of young Black women, I think, are really compelling and nuanced, and something that we really have not seen. If we want to talk about print comics, I'm thinking of things like the title Niobe and artists like Phil Richardson, who's brought that to light, as well as Amanda Sandberg's writing. And I guess I should also say Ashley Woods also drew Niobe. But going back to history, before I mentioned Jackie Orms, the cartoonist Jackie Orms, one of her comics that she did in Black newspapers was called Patty, Joe, and Ginger. And it was about this young, like, toddler almost, and her older sister who was like in her older teens. And so the cartoonist would imbue all of these politics and important issues of the day voiced through this really young toddler girl. And what I think was so amazing about this, and again, this was the 1950s that she was doing this, is that younger folks and older folks had the opportunity in those Black newspapers to see that representation, to see a young Black girl. These characters were middle class, and we can say a lot more about class and the problematics of representing middle class identity. So that's a whole nother conversation. But the point is, at that historical moment, there were no representations of the Black middle class. I mean, there were some, they weren't prevalent. And so here you have this young girl talking about politics and just being interested in racism and civil rights and things that were going on at that moment. And these young women were, I guess, sort of attractive in the stereotypical way in which people perceive of beauty, which is very problematic. But just the idea that Black women could be desirable and look different ways is something that her gags, her one-strip comics really brought to light. I'm thinking of the amazing film Fast Color, that depicts a younger Black woman and her young daughter as sort of with superpowers, but really kind of imprinting that on to some of the issues of the day that we've already talked about, in terms of like how Black women are seen and the different types of things that they may interface with in their life, just sort of difficult things in terms of substance abuse and interactions with the law and all these things that the film Fast Color sort of talks about through these contemporary Black women characters. And so, I really liked what Craig had to say as well. And, at the end, in terms of representation, and it made me think of the cultural studies and sociologist Stuart Hall, who said, some forms of representation don't matter at all. And I mean, just to say that it's not, and everyone on this panel knows this, it's not just about, people of color showing up or appearing. It's about the nuance of the representations, the diversity of the representations, and not positive representations, but just sort of real authentic people showing up as who they are in a variety of ways, not in the ways in which the dominant culture oftentimes imagines us to be, and or some type of really sanitized, and I think Craig was talking about this as well, the sanitized image that, only God or something could inhabit in real life. And so I'm happy to talk more, but I know we're pressing up against time too. So
no, this is phenomenal. And I think consistent across all of y'all's responses, as well as the work that you're doing, is kind of thinking about nuance, but also thinking about sort of how are we not only resisting against some of those dominant or master narratives that we are sort of handed through mainstream culture, pop culture, or the academy, but also sort of taking over the modes of production, so that sort of like
yes.
those questions and those problems become a little bit different, right? Because I think that this makes me think about 2020 as a whole, because I think so much of our dialogues that we're having or that we're seeing this year, oftentimes we see it framed in the context of like resisting something or pushing back against something. And sometimes I wonder, when we frame it in that language, we almost still center the folks who are doing that oppressive behavior, right? sort of always centering sort of the violence that they're enacting, and the ways in which they're sort of trying to like enforce sort of that like white supremacy, as Cass was saying on an earlier panel, and never ultimately decentering that, right? Because that also kind of informs my interest in things that we see right now of like multicultural cast ensembles, where like, to get back to what Craig was saying of like, maybe you'll get 1 or 2 characters of color, but oftentimes it's still kind of like tethered to very specific stereotypes or expectations about how those characters should look or behave. And so I wondered, to kind of segue to one of the audience questions that we got, there's kind of more interest to hear about how we do that effective work of decolonizing the publishing industry. And I think for me, when I read that question, I think of the publishing industry, both in terms of what y'all have spoken to in terms of comic book publishing, but I'm also thinking about this in terms of academic publishing, because I think those two are not all that different from each other. And so to kind of center this question from the audience, from J.M. Hunter, I'm wondering if y'all can kind of respond to where he asks, how do we decolonize the publishing industry? And he says, oftentimes when there's an event or focus in the media on, say, George Floyd and other atrocities, it borderlines becomes bad-like to want to reach out to creators of color and marginalized groups, but it doesn't seem to be as much actual follow-through, which I think takes us back to what Lee was saying about thinking about sort of on what terms and conditions are we doing this work. And so I wonder if you all can perhaps speak to how you're thinking about the year 2020 that builds upon, right, doesn't totally diverge from things that have already been happening, but just sort of how you see this question of how do we do this decolonizing work, or kind of this work in general, especially in this context of sort of an attention economy that puts temporary focus on things, but then shifts aside. So I'm wondering if maybe we can go to Fernanda, and then Lee, and then Craig, and then Deborah.
Well, I'm not an artist, but I can talk about how to decolonize maybe my syllabus in my classroom. So first of all, the classes I'm teaching this year, I'm focusing on everything produced by female artists, female writers, and female scholars. And I am so sorry, but men, our life has been your turn. So in my classes this year, we are only reading, analyzing, and talking about female work. And maybe for once, maybe next year I will do something mixed, but for this time I'm doing just that. And also I am directing my students to the artist websites, Instagram accounts, Facebook accounts, to first of all, to have direct contact with the artist, the scholar, or the professor. And second, to give our money to the artist. So no Amazon, no bookstore, no any third party that will sell the artist's work. I am asking my students to buy it from the artist. And I'm also inviting these artists to my class to Zoom with us and to talk to my classroom and to my students about their work, how they publish their work, how they sell their work, how they promote their work. So my students will have direct contact with the person who they will read in the narrative. And so, buying from the artist, reading the artist, and also sometimes comparing the official or mainstream narrative of one event and the personal storytelling of the same event from the artists that we are teaching in the classroom that day. So for example, the Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico in 2017. We are going to read the webcomics of Rosa Colon, which is a queer female artist from the island. And we are also going to see some dispatched from CNN or from any local news or whatever, how the American media told the story of the hurricane and how this queer Boricua artist told her story of living and surviving the hurricane through a webcomic. So it's not just about reading the stories, but it's also about empowering the artists on like, we are your market, we will buy you, we will spend our money on you, we will buy from you. So that way, we are also decolonizing the independent circuit of the market on female artists of color. So that's it. That's what I can tell about this.
Yeah, fantastic. Lee, talk to us a little bit more about those modes of production and kind of how you're envisioning that kind of new way of doing that storytelling work.
Yeah, I think to the question around, you know, decolonizing, I don't think, my perspective, it is not my responsibility to decolonize. The colonizer has to decolonize. My role is about revitalizing and re-indigenizing, right? So that's what I got to put forward into this work, because, you know, I'm colonized. I can't get out of that. What am I you know, so for what we're trying to do, I think it's really important. One of the big issues that we face is, and I love hearing this, is the representation of Native women as well. And so part of that narrative, I write a lot of Native women characters into my stories as the protagonist, as the centralized character. And I work with Native women illustrators to keep me on point. Because I'm a dude, I recognize that, you know, that's how I identify. So I know it's not entirely my story to tell. So the comic book I wrote, Six Killer, I worked with Wishelia Alvitre on that one as well, telling the story of a Native woman that is seeking revenge for the murder of her sister. Because for us, missing murdered Indigenous women is that ultimate and final act of erasure. Native women's voices are matrilineal society. That is the final act of genocide against Indigenous peoples, right? As you take away our mothers, you take away our sisters, you take away our daughters, that ends our lines, right? So for me, that part of that storytelling is so critical, you know, in terms of ensuring that those voices and those authentic voices of Native women. So it's not just voices that are in service of colonization, right? So half the children's books that have been produced in the recent past decades feature two Native women, Sacagawea and Pocahontas. And both of their narratives are used in service of manifest destiny and colonization. We don't hear about warrior women. We don't hear about Native women that fight back, that are the ones, you know, you don't have, there are a few stories of Lozin, but she's not portrayed like Geronimo, because it's also this toxic masculinity and this colonial masculinity that comes in. So a lot of the re-engineering, the revitalizing is saying, like, we got some badass Native women out there that are doing some incredible work. We got Native women that are doing work where you don't even recognize that they're doing work. They're so amazing, right? So those are the stories that we look at. And then that last part is making sure that we publish it, right? I tell folks, same thing. I was like, go to the artist or there are 3 Native bookstores in the United States. It is us at Red Planet Books and Comics, it is Birch Bark Books, and it is La Resistencia in Austin, Texas. If you want to buy and support, we can't do this work unless you're supporting us, and we're the ones we can pipeline this. So I was like, I don't like Lee Francis. I was like, cool, go buy from them instead. I don't care. Just support Native writers, illustrators, and creatives, because that's the way that we can, you know, re-indigenize and revitalize our own systems so that we can continue to tell our own stories.
Craig, your thoughts, and then Deborah, you will likely get the last word. Craig, you're muted.
Thank you. This is a really complex and difficult question that really kind of hits onto a lot of like personal and social things. I guess like as far as doing my best to decolonize, it's really about being critical of my own work and trusting people around me to share their stories and their voices. You know, I think that it starts off with kind of making sure that you're comfortable with who you are, and that each person really finds themselves rather than relying heavily on narratives that they're told. And so discover who you are, find yourself, and then move forward. But allowing for the youth to not accept the stories that they're told is really important to me. I think that once we change the common narrative, I think, you know, I'm like, honestly, I can't like, I'm such a capitalist, no matter how much I complain about it. Like, I would love to know how to function in a better world, but if someone made this world better tomorrow, I would feel weird about it. And so allowing the future generations to be more comfortable with a better place is a big part of what I think we kind of have to do. And with that note, I like, honestly, I'm looking at things in terms of text and subtext as an artist. I actively teach students how to make stories that other people want to read, primarily to like large populations and swaths of populations. I make stories that are consumable for white people with enough subtext and code switching that Black people get it. You know, like I want to make things with that have this, you know, James Bond narrative with you know, on the top with just Angela Davis in like one of the inner layers of a story, just because I know that I won't be able to sell an Angela Davis cake. So after and so until the day that we can raise a youth to consume Angela Davis cakes, I have to make, you know, Superman cakes with Angela Davis filling, and and you know, and try to incorporate cautionary morals around the narratives about the dangers of neoliberalism and capitalism. That's, I mean, that as far as brass tacks of like, if you're curious how I'm approaching the problem in kind of a very step-by-step way, that's kind of how I'm approaching it. And it's oversimplified, it's problematic in so many ways, and that's the part where I hope that younger people of color from diverse backgrounds and abilities can help fill in the gaps, because at some point I'm gonna be just some old cranky dude who's way out of touch.
Are we ending at 2:15 or 2:30?
2:15.
Okay, so I've got a couple minutes. I've got so much to say. So in terms of decolonizing the publishing world, you know, one of the things that I think about is getting yourself to the position where you can start your, I mean, I just recently started my own journal, right? And you're able to publish those voices that sometimes don't make it into the mainstream, making sure you make yourself available to review articles for journals, especially, you know, folks who are from underrepresented groups, and they're able to read these submissions that maybe other folks reading those submissions may not have the sort of same constructive feedback as someone else might have. And so I think, you know, for me, it's just about continuing to put myself in the position where I can help others, and to think about how to use the very little bit of power I have. And I wouldn't even call it power, but leverage, to help someone else in the ways in which I was helped, and the ways in which I was not helped. And then I guess I'll just close to say, also to be true to yourself, right? Because before we were talking about, even though the field has widened so much, there's still a dearth of different types of images. And, you know, I think of, you know, when I was a graduate student doing a dissertation on Black sororities, you know, most people thought that was ridiculous. Some people believed in me, a lot of people didn't. Some people wanted me to do a comparative study. Oh, why don't you compare, you know, Black women sorority members to white women, you know, and I didn't do it. You know, I mean, you know, you have to go along with things and follow the rules in so many ways. Like, you can't just always be a rebel in a way that doesn't allow you to finish. But I just was persistent, and I'm glad that I was, because in my persistence, it, you know, opened the roads for others, just as Black women did to me. When, you know, when Trisha Rose was writing her dissertation on hip hop, people supported her, but some people thought it was ridiculous. And Black Noise is still one of the top books on rap of all times. Just think if she just, you know, decided, no, I'm not, you know, I'm not going to press it, I'm not going to do this. So yeah, definitely putting yourself in the position as a publisher or someone who is reviewing publications to get those voices out there. So much more to say, but I want to be respectful of our time.
May I jump in really quickly and ask Dr. Whaley, would you share in the chat the name of your journal and how we can access this and blast it out? All of the scholars we want so badly.
I would love that. I'll put it in the chat. It's called Addressing the Crisis, and it's focused on the work of Stuart Hall in cultural studies.
Yes. Thank you.
Kiedra, would you like to take us into our next panel, but also like close out this one?
I would love to, except there's a knock at the door. Hopefully y'all can't hear it. It is so obnoxious.
On that note then,